one thing to emphasize, I guess, about the book for people who haven't read it is that it tries to cover, a really very large sweep of history.
Yeah.
It's very much deliberate, and I was encouraged by my editor very much to go up to the present day, because that would be a way to reconnect.
Absolutely.
Some of the things that I say right at the start, which are more the sort of general sketching of like what analytic philosophy is like, sort of in the present, to kind of go full circle and come right back. So there was for me a real emphasis on making it a really big picture story, because I think that's something to start bringing in some of the criticisms of analytic philosophy that pop up along the way. It's something analytic philosophers are very wary of.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are very good reasons for being wary of big picture narratives, because the thing that's motivating them is that they want to be very careful and precise, and those are great things. But just the act of doing a history, and now this is a social history, and I could say a bit more about why it's social history, but to do kind of a history of analytic philosophy that is quite as sweeping as it is was very much a deliberate decision. And so I wanted people to feel like, but hang on, there's more to be said, and can we take this further? So that in a way, it's music to my ears to hear that. That's your response.
Well, oh no, absolutely. I mean, actually, as just to continue on this thread, I think it's interesting. Some of the later figures you talked about, so I knew personally, right? So, for example, Charles Mills was my neighbor, actually. Wow. I was neighbor with Charles Mills, and I would run into him. I would have philosophy. I was a young philosophy student in Chicago, and I read, the racial contract and Blackness Visible had just come out at that point. So, and it's sort of like, what your book offered is actually a kind of a remapping of a lot of these figures, because despite, I guess, getting a sense that they were analytically trained, there's this sense in which he in particular, never presented himself in that way, and that's part of the narrative as well, right? But in my head, at least, as a young student, I often thought of sort of political, especially left-wing political thinkers as sort of neither of those camps per se.
I think Mills. Yeah. I mean, Mills is a very interesting case. I mean, made more interesting by the fact that he's your neighbor.
No, not. But that's a quirk of mine.
That's very interesting. He was interesting to me among some of the figures that I talk about, because it actually wasn't clear to me what I would end up saying. The Racial Contract, for people who don't know the book, it's an extraordinarily powerful book. When I first taught this book in class, I had a student come up to me sort of just outside the class in the corridor and said, I just want to say something. And the student said, reading this book has completely changed the way I see everything.
Wow.
That kind of impact. Wow. Capable of having that kind of impact. And I found Mills kind of endlessly intriguing, because there was a sort of sense of being analytic adjacent, but there was this powerful Marxism coursing through the writing. And then I looked at his PhD dissertation, and that to me was very interesting, because the way that the PhD dissertation set up is very much in terms of the kind of questions that analytic philosophers ask, very much conceptual questions.
Right.
And I thought, that's interesting. So early on, there was a sense in which a kind of analytic identity was I think there in his writing. I mean, it's interesting to know from you whether he would have articulated that, or whether he would have described himself as an analytic philosopher, or whether he would have, not wanted to say that.
Yeah. I wasn't high level enough to have those broader conversations with him. I asked him about contents in the book. I asked him about the tradition, because as a student, you learn political philosophy via the liberal tradition, right? So often the first thing you read is Locke. And then the second thing you read might be Hobbes or Rousseau, right? And so forth. And that's sort of the door. And insofar as he was calling a lot of that material into question, and also the relation between the sort of, okay, somebody wrote a book a few hundred years ago, but whatever, how was it implemented, and what is the actuality of those concepts? Those kind of questions. I think mapping the figures that you do in the way that you do also opens you up to, I wouldn't say attack. I don't think anybody would attack you on this, but they would sort of say, no, I would rather put him here. I'd rather put him there. So I think there is a danger of this like great cast of characters, because somebody is going to have issues with your casting decisions, right? It's like, well, no, this person actually belongs more here. That person belongs more there. And so I would say, constantly whilst reading the book, I had a conversation. I kept having a kind of conversation like, wouldn't that be more appropriate? Or now I'm totally going off the notes I prepared. But I think, so for example, another case is Dummett, right? Michael Dummett, who, is a kind of arch analytic, right? One of the sort of founders of the genre, if you will. But they then also engaged in political things, philosophy regarding immigration and things like that, right? And from a certain perspective, especially, let's say, from the perspective of 2024, 2025, looks like an insane radical, right?
Yeah.
And so you might say, well, okay, well, there's a different way of partitioning the person into the part of them that is like a Phrygian sort of logically guided analytic philosophy. And then there's a part of them that is something else, right? And you might negotiate those relationships kind of differently. From that perspective.
Maybe it's helpful to say something about Dummett and the role that I give him, because as you say, it's an unusual way to cast him. So I mean, what happens, I think it's chapter 7 at some point, way into the book, Frege finally makes an appearance. This is very deliberate, and I can, to say it now, I guess. I mean, my history starts in 1898. It starts with Russell and Moore, and I specifically don't start with Frege because I think in a social history of analytic philosophy, it doesn't really make sense to start with Frege, because Frege's work just wasn't received in the sort of way that we, as people who've studied philosophy in universities in the Anglosphere, sort of assume that Frege would have been received, right? So Frege was really received in this very narrow way by people who were interested in mathematical logic. The kind of image that we have of Frege as something like the founder of analytic philosophy is really tied to a particular interpretation of his work. It's a very interesting interpretation. That's Michael Dummett's interpretation, according to which Frege has a significance that's analogous to that of Descartes. Now, I know this is controversial about Descartes too, but okay, let's say it, right? So Descartes undertook an epistemological turn, right, by which first philosophy, the foundational starting discipline of philosophy, became not metaphysics any longer, but epistemology. So we begin from the question, what can I know? Frege did something analogous, but it's the linguistic turn. So philosophy is now made into a discipline whose first philosophy is philosophy of language. Question about what exactly that means, but somehow philosophy is turned linguistic by Frege. And this is the interpretation of Frege's significance that we owe to Dummett. And the thing that really interested me was how Dummett's interpretation was able to be so influential, and like what it was in analytic philosophers that made them so receptive to sort of running with that idea. So Dummett, like many of the kind of prominent characters, and there are quite a few sort of protagonists in this book, I sort of make no apology for that, because I think analytic philosophy is much more actually dominated by protagonists than its self-image suggests, because the self-image is very sort of democratic, everyone can participate, non-hierarchical, and I think that's deceptive. But Dummett plays this very, very leading role, and it's a very distinctive role, right? These huge books that he writes that are really interpretative works on Frege that are at the same time highly reconstructive. They're not scholarly works in any kind of standard sense, I think. And then Dummett actually, I mean, some of the first serious exposure I had to Dummett was actually his work on immigration and refugees, which I was enormously impressed by. And it sort of perhaps reflects, in a way, something of, perhaps there's a sort of other side to this sort of questing figure that's sort of putting Frege on the map in this very distinctive and unusual way. He was very distinctive and unusual too in his approach to immigration politics, where he really, really stuck his neck out and invited people to speak in Oxford that really got him into trouble in the eyes of some people, and was extraordinary. And this is the thing that I really admire about Dummett: he's extraordinarily proactive about his immigration work. So he would get in the car and drive to Heathrow Airport or to the port of Folkestone and argue on behalf of people seeking to enter the country, and rebutting the things said by the immigration officers and so on. Right. So he was a real activist, right? He's someone
who absolutely
got in there, and so really unusual. And you have these figures in analytic philosophy that are overt leftists.
Right.
Another example is, of course, Hilary Putnam, who was a Maoist.
Right.
And there's a really big question about how do you, what sense do you make of people's avowed personal, political, in the case of those guys, not just beliefs, they weren't just things that they said to other people, but, actions that followed on those commitments. And I think so. Something I try to do in the book is, and I don't state this explicitly, but it's sort of run through the attitude that I take in the book. I try to, keep apart the social and political as it shapes, collective entities, and as it shapes. So in some cases, if you take the movement of logical positivism, it implicitly and explicitly and overtly shapes this group of people and their activities. I'm interested in those sorts of collective shapings of the way an intellectual group operates and what sorts of things it becomes interested in, what sort of things it pursues, as opposed to, people's own personal commitments and diverge. I don't go very far into those cases where they diverge, because because the interest is, my interest is in these sort of larger scale phenomena. It's certainly true that, when you look at what views do people actually express, I suppose it's very rarely liberal views, actually, except among political philosophers, because the liberal view doesn't really need expressing.
That's right.
Sometimes it's Maoism, and sometimes it's something like Dummett's, stance on immigration, which is really was not part of the political mainstream in any way in the UK at the time.
Or now. Or now. That's interesting. I mean, I have some personal anecdotes about Putnam as well, about his Maoism, but one of the questions that I'm sure readers will encounter while reading your book is like, well, so you're telling the social history, and sometimes it dips into the personal, individual background, formation, and then also, for example, in the sequence, a brilliant sequence in the book, which a very nice retelling of Red Vienna and the figures in the Vienna Circle who were involved in politics, and the sort of back and forth on some of those issues, and the sort of avowed Stalinists and the ones who aren't, et cetera, et cetera. That's a fascinating discussion. I want a whole book that's just that, actually. But there, for example, you do sort of go into people's where their political positioning, let's say, took them to certain avenues, and cast them as a certain kind of figure in the circle as opposed to other figures. But for example, but with Dummett and some other figures, you can sort of think, well, like, is it really, you know, where are the limits at which you sort of say, okay, this is relevant, this is personal, or whatever, and then that is like a little bit of neologicism, or sort of a
Yeah.
certain view on philosophy of mathematics, right? Where do those things kind of really tug at each other?
I think something that I really strongly wanted to resist,
Hmm.
um, and I have sort of principled grounds for this, is to actually have just one line on that question. So I'll say what I mean. So the case of the Vienna Circle, I think, is interesting because it sets some of the rest of the history of analytic philosophy into relief, because it is itself, it's a different kind of formation
Mm.
from the other things that form part of this history, in the sense that this group, it was very much a self-conscious grouping.
Hmm.
I mean, it starts as the so-called Schlick Circle, and then later
Hmm.
somebody, Otto Neurath, I think, comes up with the term the Vienna Circle, kind of quite sort of grandiosely. But it was always a self-consciously formed group, and it always thought not only about itself as a group, but also thought about its politics and the relation between its politics and its other intellectual commitments. Right? This is widely thematized, and
Sure,
then
sure.
also, in terms of the internal discussion, it's really interesting that Moritz Schlick, who's the founder, plays this role of sort of keeping everyone, in some sense, keeping everyone happy. Right? He's the sort of more neutral figure, and so there's this kind of conscious negotiation. What do we do with the people that are into this radical social program of universal housing, universal education, and so on, that some of the left wing of the Vienna Circle were into, as opposed to the people that, as the famous phrase goes, prefer to stay on the icy slopes of logic. Right? This is very much, consciously done. Whereas in other parts of the story, you don't, the kind of intellectual formations that you get don't have that sort of structure, or they don't have that sort of cohesion. They might have a different kind of way of hanging together. And so I sort of don't want to give one answer to the question, what's the relationship between, for example, what people, avowedly express in terms of their political beliefs and what you take to be ideology. Because I think, in my view, a good social history that covers such a sweep sort of respects that actually the social phenomena under consideration change in character. And it's almost, I would say, well, I'm tempted to say that it's something that analytic philosophers in particular are likely to expect, that you'll say, well, the structural relation between element A and element B, I take to be such, and now I'm going to see the history through that sort of prism, to keep on establishing that relationship. And I think that's a mistake. And I very much came to feel more and more strongly as I was writing the book that it would be a mistake to take the history in that way. So, I mean, one thing to say about, just as a sort of overall sweep of the book, is that as you'll probably have, or hopefully have experienced, or you tell me if it was different, but the opening set of chapters reads perhaps much more like a kind of collective biographical intellectual history of a sort of set of figures. Largely because people like Russell and Moore, and also the Vienna Circle and the Oxford philosophers, thought a great deal about their own identity, and they thought a great deal about methodology, and this was really sort of driving them a lot. And that's part of what makes them the groups that they were. After the Second World War, you get this very interesting phenomenon, I think, which is that you start to get this one thing, analytic philosophy, which there really hadn't been before, because before that there were these distinct movements. Right? The Vienna people and the Cambridge people didn't really talk to each other, and they had to be brought together. So Max Black and Susan Stebbing were the two big people who tried to do this, but they had these two camps that they were trying to put into dialogue, and for that to be the case, there had to be two camps, right, to start with. But after the war, you get this strange phenomenon that analytic philosophy seems much more amorphous. It's like this one group. but methodologically, there isn't really agreement on very much. There's there's agreement on a certain kind of intellectual attitude, and there's a shared literature. But thanks largely to the work of people like Quine and people like Sellers in the 1950s, there was this very high level of sort of methodological scrutiny, which led to a methodological inner collapse of a very interesting kind, right? These are very interesting thinkers. So in that latter part of the book, which is that, dealing with what I would call analytic philosophy, so-called, and because it has to go under that name, I become much more interested in sort of what holds an intellectual formation together. So, for example, if you look at the people in Oxford who were pursuing what they called the Davidsonian program, which was a program in the philosophy of language, I'm not so much interested in sort of what they say about themselves as a group. I'm interested in questions like, but why was it that this program sort of continued on, even though nobody could really, hand on heart say that it had achieved what it had set out to achieve. And then at a certain point, its tendencies and its sort of characteristic questions keep on being asked, but they get sort of reformatted and reimagined and reused, and they become part of sort of a new thing, which is related to the ancestor. But it's a new thing in which, very acute philosophers are tackling a set of like very precisely defined and sometimes very technical questions, of which, as a sort of social historian, it's interesting to ask, but why? What was it about these kind of questions that captured people so much that they wanted to continue on a track where, in some sense, the previous methodological rationalization no longer held? So, like, what is it about that group that means that everybody continue to want to do that, together?
Yeah, I have my own kind of hypotheses about that. I sort of think about like that first generation as being like a tree that is able to achieve some sunlight, but then you have all these vines that start growing around it, and it's just able to get sunlight because of the tree, but the tree dies, the tree itself dies, but all the vines continue to thrive, perhaps even better because the tree had died, something like that. Yeah, I mean, so you've invoked the American part of it. So we've gone from, let's say, southern Germany to Vienna, and then to what is the United Kingdom today. But then you have these Americans, Quine and Kripke and Sellers. So there's something about the sort of like cross-Atlantic perception of this phenomenon. And of course, there is a kind of homegrown, if you will, American philosophy, that of pragmatism or pragmaticism, as Peirce like to put it. And they sort of created a sort of fertile ground somehow to sort of reincorporate all this sort of neo-Freudianism and this obsession with language and speech acts, and just create a new kind of a new mix, a new cocktail of ideas and methods. And and somehow only the Americans were able to properly name it, as you put it nicely in your book. But a lot of those figures like Sidney Morgenbesser, those figures were all sort of would probably, if you ask them, you would say, "Oh, I'm a pragmatist, I'm not an analytic philosopher." But they created analytic philosophy in a way, but in this kind of mirror that you cannot see through, kind of somehow,
The cross-Atlantic relationship is interesting in so many ways. I mean, something I didn't realize until I was doing the research on this book was Quine's quite complicated relationship with American logic in particular. And there's a sense that he had that he was importing, the proper approach to logic into the United States, and he was displacing the tradition that there'd been at Harvard, which is where he'd studied.
Right.
Associated with C.I. Lewis in particular.
Yes.
Thing about. And there was a sort of gesture of saying, well, I went to Prague and Vienna, and I, ate from the hand of Rudolf Carnap.
Yeah.
I'm, I'm overcoming the kind of muddle-headedness that there is in American logic. So there's this sort of Europeanizing thing. I guess I'm singling out Quine because the more obvious thing to say, even though it's also surprising, is how much of analytic philosophy as it was constituted, as I put it, in America, was made by European emigres, right? So people like Herbert Feigl, who played a really, really massive role, I think, in the creation of analytic philosophy, and many others like Carnap, Reichenbach from Berlin, Alfred Tarski from Poland. These European figures played a really, really big role in that, and that has the implication that the relationship with pragmatism is really complex. Something that I made actually really early on in writing this was not to get into pragmatism, not because pragmatism isn't interesting, but because pragmatisms play this very complex and shape-shifting role, sort of across the 20th century. And it made this sort of strange comeback as the sort of radical edge of American philosophy with people like Richard Rorty, who really sort of reimagined it.
Right.
And Putnam has this complicated relationship with pragmatism. So, I think there should be a book, a kind of social history of American pragmatism. I really encourage you to write that.
Somebody. So we're actually running about out of time a little bit, but I do want to ask you about how you see the causal relationship between the social context and the theoretical or normative content in the philosophy. I mean, I just mean sort of beyond the general sense of let's reform philosophy to be as, let's say, politically neutral as we can, to sort of be under the sort of general unobjectionable type of argument style and language, to be as plain spoken as possible, to sort of, to not import, let's say, exotic terminology or logical styles, right? Beyond that, like, how do you connect the social context with specific ideas?
Well, I was going to say there's a great deal, I think, in what you were just saying. But before that, when you said beyond that.
Okay.
Seems to me actually the kind of place I would look for the answer to your question about, as you put it, causal relationship between the social context and the intellectual content. Because I talk about this a little bit near the beginning of the book in relation to a review that very young Bernard Williams wrote of J.G. Warnock, where Williams sort of takes Warnock to task for, I suppose you could call it kind of fantasy of the common man. That's really important to Oxford philosophy of a certain period. And there's versions of it in different bits of this whole analytic history, I think, where it's precisely at the points where people say things like, let's take up the ordinary standpoint, or let's think about how the ordinary man in the street actually sees the world. Where, as Williams points out, he doesn't use the word ideology, but he's basically saying, hang on a second, ideology is creeping in here, because actually the kind of high priests of sort of ordinary philosophy, like Warnock, are imposing a certain particular, set of commitments and way of viewing the world, which they, by saying that this is the ordinary way of viewing it, they're giving it a certain kind, they're giving it a certain kudos. Whereas actually, and something that I found really fascinating in reading about experimental philosophy, which is an episode very much in the recent history, was that whatever else you say about experimental philosophy and whether you think it's a good idea, so philosophy by going into the street and asking people questions and seeing just what they say spontaneously, it turned out that actually people in the street say all kinds of things analytic philosopher wouldn't think that the person in the street would say. Like the person in the street has all sorts of elaborate things to say about the distinction between appearance and reality, for example.
And I would add that that would already be much more rigorous, because I've read papers by British philosophers of very high repute published in the last 10 years that basically say, well, this is how this word is usually understood in English, and therefore
by competent users of English.
Right, competent users mean this with this word, therefore. That's not a good inference for anything. Nothing follows from that, therefore, right? But it's a habit. And when we started, and I said something like, when you meet somebody's parents, you finally realize why they have certain habits. And this is one of those where it's sort of so bewildering for somebody not from the tradition to sort of think, how'd you end up there? Who told you this was allowed?
So it's very odd because, in a tradition that prides itself on rigor, and I take rigor to be as important as the next person. It's curious that you can make arguments like, well, this is how the word is used, or there are ways to respond to arguments that take the form that strikes me as false. Something that seems we're just going by gut reaction, and then not why do I have that gut reason? Because gut reactions tend to be very much shaped by the culture.
Which is why I personally like to get into slightly more technical philosophical subjects, because often people don't have intuitions about things, and so you sort of you just kind of it's what the sort of the set of equations are trying to do, or the axioms, whatever. Whereas in ethics, I find especially strong when you're debating some topic, it's the room will be full of people trying to make their intuition sing in the crowd, right? So we're coming to it, and I have actually a bunch of other questions. I mean, I would say, let me ask you this question as a closing. What do you think this specific analysis of analytic philosophy as a kind of way of mapping intellectual life in the 20th century until the present, or let's say the late 19th century until the present? It's sort of a diffracted mirror of modernity. How do you think your findings in this book reflects onto our neighbor disciplines like economics or geography or something like that? So just as I joke, geography goes in a way in the other direction, right? Whereas geography, perhaps in the late 19th century, early 20th century, was sort of this kind of neutral attempt to understand the globe, right? And now, and through the 60s and 70s, it's come radicalized and very value laden, right? And some of the sort of most let's say ideological proponents of certain views really come from geography, and it's in geography that you'll find sort of like the most left-wing elements, or perhaps even the most right-wing, right? So these different disciplines go through kind of inverse trajectories almost, right? And so what do you think your work is sort of can kind of diffract or reflect our neighbor disciplines? I would say, let's say economics, geography, linguistics, stuff like that.
I feel almost like someone should write a book about the academy as a whole and ask this question that's suggested by your question of why is it that some disciplines get to be radical or end up the ones that are supposed to kind of carry the burden of being radical, like geography. Some of the Marxists are in geography. That's right. Kind of their natural home. Whereas economics, okay, there are heterodox economists, of course there are. Right. They have their place in the academy, but there's this enormous resistance to them, displacing the leading paradigm, which is the empiricistic paradigm,
classical,
which is a kind of cousin to analytic philosophy. So that's, sorry, that wasn't quite what you were asking me, but that's an interesting question that you brought in me. what does it have? Yeah, what are its implications for other disciplines? I mean, I suppose there's some interest in thinking about economics in particular because there's been this very close alliance, I think, between neoclassical economics and the sort of empiricistic mentality that runs through analytic philosophy.
Mhm,
Of course,
mhm.
people will object, we're not all empiricists and so on, and I hear that, but one of the things, of course, that the book opens itself to is analytic philosophers in particular saying, well, this doesn't cover every case. Now,
Mhm.
that's the thing that analytic philosophers really care about, and perhaps
Sure.
one of the things I tried to promote with the book is the idea that one might not be so, wedded to those notions as the paradigm sort of trains you to be. But I think thinking more about economics particularly interesting because analytic philosophy, I think, can serve often as a kind of more powerful glue for holding together a liberalism and empiricism
Mhm,
in the
mhm,
academy
mhm.
than seems to be the case. Because
Right.
philosophy is often
Right.
regarded as sort of not very
Right.
important in
Right.
the academy, but I think
Right.
it carries actually a much greater importance than is often recognized because
Mhm.
philosophers spend so much time sort of propping up, the ideology as it appears in the sister disciplines, and then drawing again on, it's a loop, right? And drawing on a certain notion of economics in which, the individual, we sort of begin from the individual, and the individual is a sort of idealized entity that's, ranking preferences and so on, which is very amenable to analytic
Mhm.
modes of thought.
Sure.
And it's striking, I suppose, I mean, to say one last thing about that, that psychology
Mhm.
used to be in the class of sort of sister paradigms to analytic philosophy because it's dominated by behaviorism.
Mhm.
Behaviorism was, completely, yeah, killed off. And if you want to do a history of sort of, you could do after history of behaviorism and look at the ways in which the sort of behavioristic mindset, reappears in
Mhm.
really,
Mhm.
radically transformed ways. They're really not like behaviorism, but it would be interesting to um, look. Certainly, historically, it'd be interesting to look at, when these disciplines were sort of traveling together and held
Mhm.
together very much by programs like
Right.
RAND, like
Right.
we really talked about, which were
Right. Funding. Yeah.
right, exactly.
Everyone needs funding.
Concrete financial structures
Yeah.
that used to hold these things together, and then in part they diverge, and in
Sure.
part um,
Sure.
they don't.
Sure. Unfortunately, I would love to talk to you for another hour about all of this and the other questions I have. I would turn to the questions, the Q&A. And how do I get to them? They're in the Q&A box. Got it. But if you will, at the very end, can you say you've read like roughly 100 years of philosophy. So I would like to ask you, what is the single best piece of work? But why don't we go to the questions first? You can think about that for a second. Okay, so there's 6 questions. The first one is very substantial. That comes from Matt Brown. So he says, I am excited to read your book, and I'm very much an advocate of your contextual, social, political histories of philosophy. One of the things that puzzles me about this kind of historiography is that early analytic philosophy tended to be more politically left/radical than most of the traditions it contrasted with. Russell, Carnap, Neurath were all quite radical compared to the many, quote, continental philosopher, consider not just Heidegger, but how much more active and radical Neurath was than Adorno and Horkheimer. The Vienna Circle Manifesto is very much an anti-fascist program. Is your view that there was a political realignment within these different philosophical traditions such that they switched sides, politically?
Great question. Yeah, I
Good
think,
question. Yeah, excellent.
there was a political realignment, and something I talk about, as you will know in a bit of detail, is the interaction between the Vienna Circle and the Frankfurt School. So this question of, who is more politically active. And it's really clear that Neurath in particular, and some other people in the Vienna Circle, were certainly more politically active. And there was sort of reticence to join left-wing parties among others of the Frankfurt School. So I think there is a realignment there. I mean, obviously there's a really complicated history on the side of what we've come to call continental philosophy, which is sort of basically just, all the European stuff that isn't to be classed with the analytics, and it's a label invented by analytic philosophers. But if you take the sort of people that are around in Germany in the early 19th century, yes, there's Heidegger, whose political views are pretty unusual. There are a few others like him. There's a very interesting modal logician called Oskar Becker, who's also a Nazi and a student of Heidegger. And proto-analytic, but also in the sense of the logical work that he did, but also kind of part of the phenomenological tradition. So interesting figure. But then you have people like Lukács and Korsch and people who are really on the radical left. So there's both going on. I suppose one thing to say about the 1930s is that there was just far more radicalism around among philosophers and other intellectuals than one might perhaps think in retrospect. And a lot of this, the sort of collective ignorance that we have about that until we start to really look in the historical record, is because of the power of McCarthyism. There was an enormous pressure to submerge a lot of people's radicalism in the 30s. So yes, I think there was a realignment, and the part of the realignment that's particularly fascinated me is members of the Vienna Circle, when they came to America, how they were effectively, as philosophers, depoliticized, how they came to be, they came to be this new thing, philosophers of science. Whereas in Vienna, they had been really scientists, physicists, mathematicians, sociologists, and so on, with an interest in philosophical foundations of those disciplines. But they came to America to do this new thing, the philosophy of science, which is very much a meta discipline. And as they did that, the radicalism really sort of dissipates in a really very striking way. And one can reconstruct some of the ways in which that happened, which was largely to do with the FBI and its role in pursuing people. So-and-so had been at a party with some physicist who had been communist and so on. And there I'm very much inspired by the work of George Reich, who has documented some of that in great detail, which I also recommend for people interested in that.
Absolutely. I would love to drill more down onto this issue, because I think it's a very complicated story, but we have to move on. So a question from that, assuming that you did research writing books and quote Karl Marx and the actualization of philosophy at a similar point, do you have any reflection from the one that you brought to the other? Oh, that's very nice. And vice versa.
That's a great question. Yeah, I probably haven't thought enough actually at that precise question. I have thought quite a bit about what it says that I wrote the two things, and how are they related to each other. And I suppose in a certain sense, I mean, the Marx book is a positive statement of what I think philosophy is and can be. And the analytic philosophy book is a quite different sort of book, in which I'm interested in a kind of Marxist, ideology critical examination of a particular intellectual formation that I have received much of my education sort of within, and wondered as a sort of developing Marxist, and by which I mean sort of also intellectual Marxist, right? How you negotiate your relationship with this sort of dominant paradigm in philosophy,
right?
Which, apart from anything, has been the paradigm that has been engaged in by some of the most talented and interesting thinkers of the 20th century. I think it's really important to say that. Yeah, I mean, the more trivial answer to the question of how they sort of how one informed the other was just it's great to write two books, sort of. They weren't quite simultaneous, but it's great to sort of have two projects on the go, but as a way to get space from one by going to the other, and quite different projects. So I liked that, and I would recommend it as a practice to other people to do that.
Great. Yeah, I would ask about the poverty of philosophy, but we have to move on. So I'm going to skip some of the questions that I think can be answered if you just read the book. So apologies to the audience members that asked questions that were more in that vein. Okay, I think this one's good. And I'm gonna just they came in this order, but I see some interesting questions coming in now. So anonymous attendee said, I was hoping to hear something mentioned in abstract about the capacity of analytic philosophy to, quote, colonize decolonial efforts when attempting to further those efforts. Can you say something more about this? In a way, you also address this in the book, but it's a topical question.
Yeah. So there's a chapter in the book. This is the last chapter in the book, which is called Colonizing Philosophy. And the idea there is to look at various strands in thought and think about how, so I'm particularly feminism and critical race theory are the things that I focus on, where I'm interested in the ways in which analytic philosophers have either sort of constructed a new version of those discourses, or in some sense taken up those discourses and transformed them, where what ends up happening is that a certain kind of liberal set of priorities in some sometimes difficult to notice way starts to creep in and then starts to take over, so that those discourses actually end up being much less radical in their function than they had originally been. So I mean, to take the example of feminism, I'm interested in the way in which there's a sort of quite specific way in which analytic feminism, which is a self-applied term, right, that emerges in the 1990s, sort of constricts itself to a certain kind of set of questions. And the history there is really fascinating, because it's really a question of settling on a particular set of debates that come from the work of Catherine MacKinnon, who is herself very much a radical, certainly self-described radical Marxist thinker, right? But the sort of questions that she asked are taken up in a particular way because they're very amenable to being read in terms of the philosophy of language, basically. And that's to do with contingencies about debates about pornography in the United States that are shaped by the kind of idiosyncrasy that you have in the United States, that pornography has to be considered in terms of speech. And it's regulated in terms of speech. And of course, as soon as you start to talk about speech and you think about the kind of thing that pornography is, it becomes very natural to talk about speech acts. And then work of J.L. Austin starts to play a major role. And we sort of get diverted into something that takes us sort of into a different territory from the territory that one might expect if one just thought it's feminism.
Yeah, absolutely. So somebody asked about given that we've discussed this conversation between Joanna Fisher, you focus on the conversation between analytic philosophy and the social sciences. Where do you think this conversation might be for philosophy, the relation between philosophy and humanities or literature, or something more in the humanistic domain?
Well, I mean, one thing to say about analytic philosophy is that, just as an immediate observation to make, it is not as comfortable with literature as a kind of thing to connect with, as so-called continental philosophy is. I think that there are good reasons for that. The whole mode of discourse is very much set by a kind of, in a certain sense, mathematicized.
I think science fiction might be a exception.
Yeah.
Right. I think a lot of science fiction, I mean, possible worlds. I mean, that practically is something out of science fiction, right? Practically. And the way the problems, right? The twin earth paradox, right? XYZ, H2O, alternate substances, are they the same thing? All those type of things, or time travel, which David Lewis, I think, wrote about even as an undergraduate. Time travel. I once went to a conference that was just all on, if there were time travel, what would that look like? Kind of, what are the some matter point to matter point relation, or what is it exactly? How does space-time have to bend exactly? This kind of thing. So I think science fiction might be the counterexample to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very salient counterexample, right? Because it's the science science fiction that means that there's a certain kind of matrix in which it's the literary, but it's a particular inflection of the literary.
That's right.
Feels right. I went to a lecture by Derek Parfit once, and the first sentence was, "We begin with science fiction." People
I mean, divided brain, all of those, as you talk about in the book, the intuition pumps there. I mean, science fiction is basically taking the same sources and just going going off on it. And science fiction also has some sort of quasi-fascistic ones, and then there are also extreme left-wing ones, progressive in the sort of traditional 20th century Marxist sense, but also sort of anarchist ones in the last, say, 30, 40 years, right? So that also has an interesting political valence that goes all around, So before we get cut off by Adelaide, what is the best piece of writing you read from these authors in the 100-year span?
So I wonder if this will surprise you, but the piece of writing that I read as part of the research for this that made a really big impact on me was Naming a Necessity, which I'd battled with as an undergraduate. I read the words and I'd sort of made my way through it. But the sheer force of it,
really,
incredible.
Really. Yeah. Agree.